Welcome to History Zettel. If you are new here, this channel investigates the forgotten operations, unsolved mysteries, and buried evidence of the Second World War. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next case. On the morning of February 12, 1941, a lean, sharp-eyed German general stepped off a transport aircraft at Castel Benito Airfield outside Tripoli. Major General Erwin Rommel, recently decorated for his command of the Ghost Division in France, had been given a mission that, on paper, sounded almost modest. He was to shore up the collapsing Italian position in Libya, stabilize the front, and wait for further orders from Berlin. Within 48 hours of landing, Rommel had driven east to the front lines and was already formulating plans to attack. Nobody had told him to wait. What Rommel found in North Africa was a shattered Italian army, a vast desert, and a British force that had grown dangerously complacent after its stunning victories over the Italians. The British 10th Army had demolished 9 Italian divisions in just 10 weeks, capturing 130,000 prisoners and advancing 500 miles into Libya. The path to Tripoli seemed open. Then Winston Churchill made a fateful decision. He stripped the victorious desert force of its best units and sent them to Greece, where a German invasion was looming. The depleted British desert garrison, now vastly weakened, would soon face an enemy of an entirely different quality. Rommel's Afrika Korps in early 1941 consisted of 2 divisions, the 5th Light Division and the 15th Panzer Division. They were a fraction of the force that had swept across France the previous year. His orders from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command, were explicit. He was to conduct a defensive posture until both divisions were fully deployed, which would not be complete until the end of May. Rommel read his orders carefully and then ignored them entirely. On March 24, 1941, less than 6 weeks after landing in Africa, and before his 2nd Division had even finished unloading, Rommel attacked. He struck with roughly 50 tanks at the British position at El Agheila on the Gulf of Sidra. The British, caught completely off guard, fell back. Within 2 days, they had evacuated the port of Benghazi. Within 3 weeks, Rommel had reconquered the entire region of Cyrenaica, sweeping the stunned British forces back across the Egyptian frontier. The entire operation covered nearly 500 miles. The German High Command was not pleased. General Franz Halder, Chief of the General Staff, flew to Africa personally to restrain his subordinate. He found the commander who had no intention of stopping. The speed of the advance stunned everyone, including Rommel's own staff. His technique was revolutionary and deeply personal. Rather than commanding from a rear headquarters, as doctrine prescribed, Rommel flew over the battlefield in a light aircraft, descended to drive in the lead vehicles, and issued orders in real time as the situation changed around him. His signals officer could often not locate him for hours. His supply officers pleaded with him to pause. He pressed forward. As one British general later admitted, Rommel's ability to move faster than his opponents could think was the decisive advantage of the early campaign. By April 13, 1941, the British had been swept from Cyrenaica and driven back across the Egyptian frontier. The sole obstacle that halted Rommel's initial momentum was the port of Tobruk, garrisoned by the determined 9th Australian Division. Rommel assaulted Tobruk twice in April and failed both times. The fortress held, his supply lines stretched dangerously thin, and the German High Command refused to send reinforcements. The campaign entered an uncomfortable pause. For the remainder of 1941, Rommel and the British fought each other to exhaustion along the Libyan-Egyptian frontier, neither side able to land a decisive blow. In November, the British launched Operation Crusader and briefly relieved Tobruk, forcing Rommel to retreat to the positions he had started from in March. The year ended roughly where it had begun. What changed everything was Malta. The British island fortress of Malta sat directly astride the Axis supply route from Italy to North Africa. From its airfields and submarine pens, British forces attacked Italian convoy after Italian convoy, sinking a staggering percentage of the fuel, ammunition, and equipment destined for Rommel's men. Throughout 1941, the Afrika Korps had received barely a fraction of the supplies it needed. Rommel's victories had been achieved on a logistical shoestring, and his failures had often been the direct result of tanks running dry in the desert, miles from the nearest fuel dump. Then, in early 1942, the strategic situation shifted dramatically. Luftflotte 2, a powerful German air fleet transferred from the Soviet Union, descended on Malta and hammered the island into near impotence. Italian convoy losses dropped sharply. Rommel, for the first time, began receiving adequate supplies. On January 21, 1942, he struck again, and the British, overextended from their Crusader advance, collapsed before him. Within weeks, he had driven them back more than 250 miles. The front stabilized near Gazala. The Gazala Battle of late May and early June 1942 was Rommel at the absolute peak of his operational art. Against a strongly prepared British defensive line anchored to the sea in the north and to the fortress of Bir Hashem in the south, he executed a sweeping armored envelopment around the southern flank. The fighting lasted 3 weeks and became one of the most ferocious armored engagements of the entire Desert War. British tank brigades counterattacked repeatedly and were destroyed piecemeal. Rommel, trapped for several days in what became known as the Cauldron, a killing ground surrounded on 3 sides, fought his way out through a combination of audacity and tactical genius that his opponents could never match. On June 21, 1942, Tobruk fell. It had held out for over 8 months during the siege of the previous year. Now it surrendered in a single day, yielding 33,000 Allied prisoners, vast quantities of fuel the British had been unable to destroy in time, and a propaganda triumph that reverberated around the world. In London, Winston Churchill received the news while meeting with President Franklin Roosevelt. He later wrote that it was one of the most devastating moments of his wartime leadership. Adolf Hitler, in distant recognition, promoted Rommel on the spot to General Feldmarschall, Field Marshal of the German Army. At 50 years old, Rommel was the youngest officer to hold that rank in the Wehrmacht. He should, at that moment, have paused. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German air commander in the Mediterranean, had been urging precisely this. The island of Malta, temporarily suppressed by Luftwaffe bombing, was recovering its strength. Operation Hercules, the planned German and Italian airborne assault on Malta, remained on the table. Kesselring argued that without the capture of Malta, the supply situation would never be secure enough to sustain a deep drive into Egypt. Rommel disagreed. He had captured nearly 2,000 tons of British fuel at Tobruk. His intelligence told him the British Eighth Army was in disarray, retreating in disorder toward Egypt. The Suez Canal was 1,000 miles from Tripoli, but it was only 300 miles from where he now stood. He made his decision. The pursuit was relentless. Rommel drove his exhausted men east through the desert heat without pause, across the Egyptian frontier. At Mersa Matruh, a brief but fierce engagement in late June drove the British further back, and the pursuit continued toward the Egyptian coastline. British resistance crumbled before him. The Eighth Army fell back in disorder, and panic spread to Cairo itself. British headquarters began burning their documents. The smoke of burning files drifted over the Egyptian capital in what Karines grimly called Ash Wednesday. The British fleet prepared to evacuate Alexandria harbor. For a few extraordinary days in late June 1942, it seemed entirely possible that Rommel would not stop until he reached the Nile. On June 30th, 1942, the lead elements of the Panzerarmee Afrika reached the railway halt of El Alamein, a desolate spot on the Mediterranean coast that nobody had ever heard of. It was just over 60 miles from Alexandria, and roughly 200 miles from the Suez Canal itself. Here, an unusual feature of the local geography finally gave the retreating British forces a defensible position. To the north lay the Mediterranean Sea. To the south, impassable to tanks and heavy vehicles, lay the Qattara Depression, a vast basin lying nearly 200 feet below sea level. Its floor, a treacherous mixture of salt flats and quicksand. The front between sea and depression measured barely 40 miles. For the first time, Rommel could not go around. The First Battle of El Alamein, fought through July of 1942, became one of the most critical engagements of the entire war. Rommel attacked the British lines again and again. At Ruisat Ridge, a low, rocky outcropping that dominated the surrounding desert, his 15 and 21st Panzer divisions came within a fraction of a breakthrough. But the Afrika Korps was exhausted and desperately short of fuel. At one critical moment during the battle, his armored formations had fuel for fewer than 100 miles of movement. He had fewer than 100 serviceable tanks remaining. The British, falling back on their supply depots at Alexandria, were growing stronger with every passing day. The logistical reality that Kesselring had warned about was now impossible to ignore. When Rommel's forces stood at El Alamein, his supply port of Tobruk lay 400 miles to the west. Benghazi was nearly twice that distance. Tripoli, the main Axis supply base, was over 1,400 miles away. Moving sufficient fuel, ammunition, and spare parts across that distance consumed an enormous fraction of whatever was delivered. One study calculated that a motorized division of the period required 350 tons of supplies daily. Moving that quantity over 300 miles of desert required 39 columns of 30 trucks, working continuously. Rommel never had remotely enough trucks. What he received at the front was a fraction of what left the ports. Meanwhile, Malta had recovered. British aircraft and submarines operating from the island once again tore into Axis convoys with devastating effect. By the late summer and autumn of 1942, Rommel's forces were receiving barely half the supplies his army required. When he launched his last offensive at Alam el-Helfa in late August, he had demanded 6,000 tons of fuel from the Italian High Command before attacking. By the time the operation began, over half his supply ships had been sunk, and only 1,400 tons had arrived at Tobruk. He ordered his men to attack anyway, gambling everything on a quick breakthrough. The new British commander, Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery, had read Rommel's intentions through decrypted signals intelligence and was waiting. The Battle of Alam el-Helfa, fought from August 30th to September 5th, 1942, was the moment the Desert Campaign turned irrevocably. Rommel's armor advanced into a prepared killing ground, the tanks running low on fuel within hours of crossing the start line. Montgomery refused to counterattack, holding his armored formations in dug-in positions and letting the anti-tank guns do their work. The Afrika Korps lost heavily and withdrew. Rommel himself fell gravely ill during the battle, his health broken by 2 years of relentless campaigning in the desert heat. He was evacuated to Germany for medical treatment. The man who returned to Africa 6 weeks later for the Second Battle of El Alamein in late October was physically diminished, commanding an army that had fewer than 200 serviceable tanks against Montgomery's over 1,000. On the night of October 23, 1942, the British Eighth Army opened the Second Battle of El Alamein with one of the most intense artillery bombardments of the war. Over 1,000 guns fired simultaneously along the narrow front. What followed was 11 days of grinding attritional combat, entirely unlike the sweeping mobile battles that had defined the previous 18 months. Montgomery made no attempt to outmaneuver Rommel. He simply applied overwhelming force until something broke. By November 3rd, the Panzerarmee Afrika had fewer than 35 tanks operational. Rommel asked Hitler for permission to retreat. Hitler sent a reply ordering the army to fight to the last man and the last bullet. Rommel began withdrawing anyway. The Great Retreat that followed carried Rommel 2,000 miles back across the desert he had crossed in triumph. Every position he attempted to hold, Montgomery attacked with methodical pressure. In November, the Anglo-American Operation Torch landed 100,000 troops in Morocco and Algeria, catching the Axis forces in a strategic vice. Rommel pulled his army back into Tunisia, fighting brilliantly to the end, and was eventually evacuated back to Germany in March 1943. 2 months later, 250,000 Axis troops surrendered in Tunisia, a defeat larger in scale than Stalingrad. What are we to make of Rommel's extraordinary African adventure? The questions it raises have never been satisfactorily resolved by historians. The first question is whether Rommel was genuinely close to a decisive strategic breakthrough, or whether the logistical constraints always made the capture of the Suez Canal an impossibility. The case that he came genuinely close rests on the terrifying rapidity of his advances, the demonstrable panic his presence induced in Cairo, and the fact that for several weeks in the summer of 1942, the British Eighth Army was close to disintegration. Several veteran British commanders later admitted that had Rommel attacked 24 hours earlier at certain critical moments, the outcome might have been different. The case against this view is equally compelling. Even if Rommel had broken through at El Alamein, his fuel situation meant his tanks could barely move. Capturing Alexandria would not have immediately solved his supply problem, since the harbor could be sabotaged and the canal blocked. His army numbered perhaps 80,000 men. The British Empire could draw on the manpower of India, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and ultimately the United States. The further Rommel advanced from his Libyan supply ports, the weaker he became. The further the British retreated toward Alexandria, the stronger they became. The mathematics of desert logistics, as Kesselring understood, always favored the defender once the attacker had outrun his supply lines. The second question is whether Rommel was the military genius his legend suggests, or a brilliantly gifted tactical commander who was ultimately out of his depth at the operational and strategic level. His admirers point to victories achieved with a fraction of the resources his opponents commanded. His critics note that every one of his great offensives eventually ran into the same wall: empty fuel tanks, broken down vehicles, and supply lines that could not keep pace with his ambitions. General Halder, watching from Berlin, was never impressed. When Rommel asked for 2 additional Panzer Corps to complete his drive to the Suez Canal, Halder asked him how he intended to supply them. Rommel replied that such matters were of no concern to him. What remains beyond dispute is the sheer scale of what Rommel and the Afrika Korps achieved with the limited resources they were given. 2 understrength divisions that arrived in Africa with orders to defend ended up driving the British to the edge of catastrophe and threatening the most strategically vital waterway in the world. Whether that achievement reflected strategic genius or gloriously reckless improvisation may never be fully resolved. Perhaps it was both. The desert, after all, punishes caution just as surely as it punishes overconfidence. In the end, Erwin Rommel came closer to the Suez Canal than any other German commander of the Second World War. That he fell short, most historians agree, had less to do with the quality of his generalship than with the 1,000 miles of desert, one stubborn island, and the inexorable logic of supply that stood between his ambitions and their fulfillment. Thank you for watching. If this investigation gave you something to think about, please comment, like, and share. Subscribe to History Zettel and join us for the next one. The file is never truly closed.